San Francisco, 1967. A 20-year-old guitarist named Carlos Santana had just played the best solo of his life. He was backstage, sweating, exhilarated, waiting for Jimi Hendrix, his idol, to tell him what he thought. Jimi walked over, looked him dead in the eye, and said 5 words that crushed him. "You're not a musician, man." Carlos felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He almost quit music that night. But 30 years later, he finally understood what Jimi meant. And when he explained it in an interview, the whole music world stopped to listen. It was August 16, 1967, and the Fillmore West in San Francisco was the epicenter of the psychedelic rock movement. Every night, the greatest musicians in the world played on that stage. Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin. And on this particular night, Jimi Hendrix was headlining. Carlos Santana was nobody yet, just another young guitarist in San Francisco trying to make it. He was Mexican, which meant most promoters wouldn't give him the time of day. He played in small clubs in the Mission District, making barely enough money to eat. But he had talent, real talent, the kind that made other guitarists stop and watch when he played. Through a connection, Carlos had managed to get a spot opening for Jimi. Not a full set, just one song, 3 minutes to prove himself in front of the man he considered the greatest guitarist alive. 3 minutes that could change his life. Carlos had prepared for weeks. He'd chosen a blues number that showed off his technical skills, fast runs up and down the fretboard, complex chord progressions, everything he'd learned from studying B.B. King and Buddy Guy. He was going to blow everyone away. When his moment came, Carlos walked on stage like he was walking into battle. The crowd was still filtering in, not really paying attention. This was just the opener, the warm-up act. But Carlos didn't care. He was playing for an audience of one, Jimi Hendrix, who was standing in the wings, watching. Carlos launched into his solo. His fingers flew across the strings. Every note was perfect, every timing precise. He hit every mark he'd practiced. The technical execution was flawless. He was showing everyone, especially Jimi, that he could play. When he finished, there was polite applause, not the roar he'd hoped for, but respectable. Carlos unplugged his guitar and walked off stage, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He'd done it. He'd played perfectly in front of Jimi Hendrix. Backstage, Carlos was pacing, too excited to sit down. His hands were still shaking from the performance. Other musicians came by to congratulate him. "Nice playing, man. Good technique." But Carlos was waiting for one person's opinion. Then he saw Jimi walking toward him. The greatest guitarist in the world, maybe the greatest who'd ever lived, was coming to talk to him. Carlos's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Jimi walked up, holding a beer, his afro silhouetted against the backstage lights. He had that look he always had, like he was seeing something nobody else could see, half present, half somewhere else.
"Hey, man," Carlos said, trying to sound casual, but failing completely. "What did you think?" Jimi took a sip of his beer, looked at Carlos for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not a musician, man." Carlos felt the words like a physical blow. "What?" "You're not a musician," Jimi repeated. "You're just a guitarist. There's a difference." Carlos's face burned with humiliation. His throat tightened. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. His idol, the person whose approval he wanted more than anything in the world, had just told him he wasn't good enough. I don't understand," Carlos managed to say, his voice cracking. Jimi put his hand on Carlos's shoulder. "You played a lot of notes up there, real fast, real technical, but you didn't say anything. Music isn't about how many notes you can play. It's about which notes you choose not to play." Carlos just stared at him, not comprehending. His brain was too busy dealing with the pain to process what Jimi was actually saying. "Listen," Jimi continued, "anyone can learn to play fast. That's just practice, just mechanics. But a musician makes you feel something. They tell you a story with the guitar. Every note matters. Every silence matters. You were up there showing off your fingers, but I didn't hear your heart. I didn't hear your soul." Jimi paused, took another sip of beer. "Right now, you're a really good guitarist. But if you want to be a musician, you got to stop thinking about impressing people and start thinking about touching them. You feel me?" Carlos nodded, but he didn't feel anything except crushed. He heard what Jimi was saying, but all his brain could process was the core message. You're not good enough. "I gotta get ready for my set," Jimi said. "But think about what I said, man. You got something. I can see it. But you're hiding it behind all that technical stuff. Let it out." He squeezed Carlos's shoulder once more and walked away. Carlos stood there frozen. Around him, the backstage chaos continued. People setting up equipment, tuning instruments, laughing, drinking. But Carlos felt completely alone. He grabbed his guitar case and left through the back exit before anyone could see him cry. He walked through the streets of San Francisco for hours, guitar case banging against his leg. He ended up at Ocean Beach, sitting in the sand, staring at the Pacific Ocean in the darkness. The fog was rolling in, cold and wet, but he barely noticed. "You're not a musician."
Those words played over and over in his head. He'd worked so hard, practiced until his fingers bled, studied every great guitarist he could find. And for what? To be told by Jimi Hendrix that he was nothing? Carlos seriously considered walking into the ocean and letting the waves take his guitar. Maybe he should just give up, get a regular job, stop pretending he could make it in music. But then he thought about what Jimi had actually said, not just the crushing opening line, but what came after. "You didn't say anything. I didn't hear your heart. You're hiding it behind all that technical stuff." Carlos replayed his performance in his mind, and for the first time, he heard it from outside himself. He'd been so focused on playing the right notes, on showing his technical skill, that he hadn't actually expressed anything. It was like he'd been speaking in a language nobody understood, just making sounds that were technically correct, but emotionally empty. He thought about Jimi's playing. When Jimi played, you felt it in your chest. Sometimes it made you want to dance. Sometimes it made you want to cry. Sometimes it made you angry or peaceful or confused, but you always felt something, because Jimi wasn't trying to impress you with how fast his fingers could move. He was trying to take you somewhere, show you something, make you feel something. Carlos sat on that beach until dawn, thinking about the difference between being a guitarist and being a musician. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand what Jimi meant. The next week, Carlos got a regular gig at a small club called El Matador in the Mission District. Instead of playing the complex, technical solos he'd been practicing, he tried something different. He played slower, simpler, but he poured his heart into every note. He thought about his childhood in Mexico, the poverty his family had escaped, the struggle of being an immigrant in America, and he let all of that emotion come through his guitar. The response was different. People stopped talking and listened. Some of them closed their eyes. A few people cried. And Carlos realized that Jimi had been right. He'd been so busy trying to prove he could play that he'd forgotten why he wanted to play in the first place. Over the next few months, Carlos developed a new style. He incorporated Latin rhythms, African percussion, blues, jazz, rock, everything he'd grown up with, everything that made him who he was. And instead of playing as many notes as possible, he played the notes that mattered, the notes that told his story. He didn't see Jimi again for 2 years. By then, Carlos had formed Santana and was starting to make a name for himself in San Francisco. They ran into each other at a recording studio in Los Angeles. Carlos was terrified that Jimi wouldn't remember him, or worse, that he'd have another crushing critique.
But when Jimmy saw him, his face lit up. "Carlos, man, I've been hearing about you. You're doing it now. I can hear it. You're not just a guitarist anymore. You're a musician."
Carlos felt tears forming in his eyes. "You changed my life that night, Jimmy. What you said to me." Jimmy smiled. "I didn't change anything, brother. I just helped you find what was already there. You were so busy hiding behind your technique, I had to kick you in the ass to get you to let your real self out." "It hurt," Carlos admitted. "Good things usually do," Jimmy said. "You think I wanted to hear all the people who told me I played too loud, too weird, too different? But I had to stop caring what people thought was right and start doing what felt true. That's all I was telling you to do." They talked for another hour about music, about finding your voice, about the difference between impressing people and moving them. It was the last real conversation they ever had. Jimmy died 8 months later, in September 1970. Carlos Santana went on to become one of the most influential guitarists of all time. But he never forgot that night at the Fillmore West, and he never forgot the lesson Jimmy taught him. In 1998, during an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Carlos told the story for the first time publicly. The journalist asked him who had influenced him most as a musician. "Jimi Hendrix," Carlos said without hesitation, "but not in the way people think." He told the story of that night in 1967, about Jimmy telling him he wasn't a musician, about how devastated he'd been. And then he explained what he'd finally understood. Jimmy wasn't insulting me. He was saving me. Because I was on a path to become just another technically proficient guitarist. The world doesn't need more of those. The world needs musicians who have something to say. And Jimmy could see that I had something to say, but I was too scared to say it. I was hiding behind technique, behind trying to sound like other people. He kicked me off that path before I got stuck there forever." Carlos paused, emotion filling his voice. "You know what the difference is between a guitarist and a musician? A guitarist plays the instrument. A musician plays the soul. Jimmy taught me that. He was harsh about it, yeah, but sometimes you need someone to be harsh to wake you up. And I've spent the last 30 years trying to honor what he taught me." When that interview was published, it went viral in the music community. Young guitarists started talking about it. Music teachers started using it in lessons. Because Carlos had articulated something that every musician struggles with: the difference between technical skill and artistic expression. Carlos started incorporating Jimmy's lesson into his own teaching. When young guitarists would come to him, showing off their speed and technique, Carlos would stop them and ask, "What are you trying to say? What do you want me to feel?" "I once had a kid play this incredibly fast, incredibly complex solo for me, and when he finished, I asked him what he was feeling when he played it, and he looked confused. He said, 'I was focused on getting the notes right.' And I told him, 'That's the problem. The notes are right, but the music is wrong. Come back when you have something to say.'" People asked if he was worried about being too harsh, about crushing young musicians the way he'd been crushed. Carlos shook his head. "There's a difference between being cruel and being honest. Jimmy wasn't cruel to me. He was honest, and that honesty changed my life. If he'd just told me, 'Good job,' and moved on, I'd have kept doing the same thing. I'd have become technically better and emotionally emptier. He cared enough to tell me the truth, even though he knew it would hurt." In 2000, Carlos Santana won 8 Grammy Awards for his album Supernatural, including Album of the Year. During his acceptance speech, he did something unexpected. He held up the trophy and said, "This belongs to Jimi Hendrix, because in 1967 he told me I wasn't a musician, and it hurt so bad that I spent the next 30 years trying to prove him wrong. But what I actually did was prove him right. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and he cared enough to push me toward it, even if it meant crushing me first. So this award isn't mine. It's for every teacher who tells their student the hard truth. It's for everyone who chooses honesty over politeness. And it's for Jimi, who taught me that being a great guitarist doesn't matter if you're not a great musician. The music world finally understood what Jimi had been saying all along. It wasn't about technique. It was never about technique. It was about having something to say and having the courage to say it, even if it means breaking all the rules about how you're supposed to play. Today, when music students ask Carlos about that night in 1967, he tells them, "Jimi Hendrix broke my heart to save my soul, and I've been grateful for it every day since, because the world didn't need another Carlos who could play fast. The world needed a Carlos who could play true." Jimi Hendrix died at 27, but his lesson to Carlos Santana has lived for over 50 years, passed down from teacher to student, from musician to musician. The lesson that technical skill without emotional truth is just noise. The lesson that you're not a musician until you stop trying to be a guitarist and start trying to be yourself. That's what shocked the world when Carlos finally explained it. Not that Jimi had been cruel, but that Jimi had been kind in the most important way possible, by telling the truth that nobody else would say. If this story moved you, remember, sometimes the harshest words are the greatest gifts. Subscribe for more stories about the moments when legends taught the hardest lessons.